recording this one too. So this is the third of these presentations that I've done this semester. Has anybody been at any of the other two? You look familiar to me. Have we met?
I was at the last one, but just not outside of that.
Okay. Well, I do want to make sure everybody knows who I am and kind of what I do here. My name is Will Donnelly. My office is over in Candler Hall in room 107. If you are curious about where that is who all in here is a SPIA major? Everybody? Do you know where your advisor is located? I'm located in that same little area over there. And if you want to set up appointments with me, you can do that via Sage, or you can also email me. And I'm the career services coordinator, so I can help with things like internships if you're looking to get those, whether inside the U.S. or outside the U.S. We certainly have a lot inside the U.S., fewer outside the U.S., but we're working on that. As well as things like jobs after you graduate. I'm really good with looking over resumes for different purposes, cover letters as well. I can help you with interviews, and I can help you just know where to look, because sometimes that can be difficult. So I'm assuming that most of you are here, not because you're necessarily set on the idea, but you're at least curious about working maybe outside the U.S., either while you're at school or not. Yeah? I'm not going to go around the room and ask everybody, but what kinds of jobs are maybe you thinking about, if you have an idea at all? Yeah.
I'd love to work for an NGO.
Okay. That's great. Yeah. Do you have one in mind, or any in mind?
No.
Okay, that's cool. Anybody else? Anybody? That's okay. That's okay. A lot of people often say the Foreign Service, the State Department. That's a good option, one way to go, and we can talk a little bit about that. A lot of people too are thinking about stuff like the Peace Corps, which is at least a 2-year commitment. There are some requirements for that as well. I have worked for the University of Amsterdam in Amsterdam, so I have some experience with this. There were some things that I can speak from experience that were a little bit unexpected to me, although not too difficult to take care of. But a lot depends ultimately on kind of where you end up going. So I've got a brief presentation here. Please feel free to raise your hand at any time or interrupt me if you have questions, or if you can fill in with any information that you think might be helpful to all of us. I just listed a few opportunities here, NGOs among them, and nonprofits generally. There are situations in which you might work for, I don't know, say a law firm that has offices outside the United States, and they might want you to work in one of those offices for a little while before returning back to the U.S. for various reasons. Even organizations like the Foreign Service have people who also work inside the United States. About a month ago, the U.S. State Department diplomat in residence, his name is Saul Hernandez, came to visit UGA, and he's been stationed at various embassies and consulates around the world, but right now he works in Atlanta, basically providing information for people who want to join the Foreign Service. These are just some ideas, but there are some things that you really want to keep in mind, especially relating to where you might be going or want to go. Countries where you shouldn't work. Any ideas of some examples? I'm going to throw North Korea out there. Part of the problem, by the way, with North Korea is not just that it can be a dangerous place in terms of extrajudicial imprisonment and that sort of thing, but part of the problem too is that there is no American diplomatic structure there. There's no embassy, there's no consulate. In Pyongyang, the U.S. works through the Swedish embassy as best they can, but without having any diplomatic relations, that can provide some kind of legal problems in terms of who's going to be there to get your back if you get in some kind of trouble. That doesn't mean, by the way, that you can't ever travel to North Korea. I don't recommend it. I've never been, I don't plan to go, but you can actually, and you might want to do this on your own time, look up on YouTube videos of people, Americans who are there on kind of special visas where they're kind of touring around the city, they visit different parks. Mostly the Americans in these videos who do this will note that one of the reasons that American travel to North Korea is so restrictive is because North Korea is trying very hard to maintain a certain narrative about what life is like there. And it looks very nice in these kinds of videos, though we all know that there are probably lots of human rights abuses going on behind the scenes. But anyway, that's just to say that you don't necessarily want to write off any place, but North Korea, places like that, and Iran may be more difficult. Is anybody familiar with the U.S. State Department Travel Advisory website? You are?
Yes.
Yeah? When have you looked at that, just curiously?
I studied abroad in Spain a couple years ago.
So did I. Not a couple years ago, but I studied abroad in Spain. Where did you study?
Valencia.
Oh, me too. At the University of Valencia?
Yes.
That's awesome. Yeah. So this is, for those of you who haven't seen it, or those of you who have, the U.S. Department of State, they have travel warnings for different countries around the world. And these may vary. At the time that you went to Valencia, were there any warnings in effect at that?
It was 2022, so there were still like COVID warnings, but it was low.
Okay, yeah. And at that time, yeah, well, and even now to some degree, there's still kind of general caution, about COVID, and that's warranted. I mean, just about anywhere you go. And I mean, to be fair, that's true here as well. So if we look at, and I'm just kind of picking on this because I'm familiar with Spain right now. What you'll see is there are the travel advisory levels. There are 4 of them. Exercise increased caution, and they have a little key over here. Terrorism potential, right? Civil unrest. Why might terrorism potentially be an issue in Spain?
There's the separatists specifically in Barcelona, that area.
Yeah, the Catalan separatists, although it's calmed down a bit in recent years, there's also the Basque separatists in the far northern part of the country. There is, you might also notice, in some European countries these days, terrorist warnings from the State Department for reasons that aren't necessarily specific to the different countries, but more specific to world events in general. So, for instance, there could be protests, against people from certain cultures. There could be protests against people from the United States. However, and I want to be clear about this too, because I think it sometimes worries people. If you go into the Peace Corps only visits places and only works in areas that have requested the help of the Peace Corps. So if you go there, that community wants you there, okay? They're always very happy to take Americans in. There are jobs in which that may not necessarily always be the case, or in other locations too. But in the Peace Corps, that's a safe bet. Did anybody here attend the Peace Corps representative talk a couple weeks ago? Yeah? Did you get anything out of it? Was it helpful?
Yeah, it was cool.
Good, good. If we look up someplace else right now, just for the sake of checking it out, Russia, right now, is do not travel. Prior to February of last year, that was not the case. But at this point, as we know, there are problems with civil unrest, wrongful detention, this is a big one, and just other risks in general that we may not even be aware of. but it can be a very dangerous place to go at the moment, just something to keep in mind. If you do look into something like a flight reservation site, I like to use Kayak, but if you look at Expedia or whatever, any of those, if you look for flights to a lot of these countries, you will not find any right now. Again, doesn't mean that there aren't like back ways to get into those countries, but in many cases they're just trying to keep people out for their safety at the moment. One place that you can go for work, and this surprises a lot of people, but it's not actually that hard to do, is Cuba. You cannot go to Cuba as just a tourist. That's where they draw the line. But if you're doing some kind of studying the culture of Cuba, or studying the Spanish language, or you're going there with a specific purpose, there is an American embassy in Havana, and there are many reasons that you can go. I've known numerous people who have gone, and so that may be worth looking into, especially if what you're thinking about is work. At the same time, it's possible in parts of the country that risk of detention is still high, so just something to keep in mind. Excuse me, by the way, my allergies are really bad right now, and I've been struggling with this all day, so I'm going to do my best, but I'm going to be a little sniffly. Get back to the presentation thing here. Is anybody interested in major intelligence agencies? Potentially. CIA, DIA, NSA. One thing that's important to keep in mind and work with those organizations, especially for instance with a group like the CIA, their arm that employs the actual spies on the ground is called the clandestine service. Spies of that sort are, and I wrote it up here, are not protected by the Geneva Conventions. Which means that, for instance, extreme detention, even execution, is a potential risk. A spy is not considered an enemy combatant. So, for instance, when we have soldiers who go into war someplace, hopefully they're fighting in a place that has signed on to the Geneva Conventions that were established after World War II. And what that means is that if the soldier surrenders, they're in a uniform, right? Ideally, that other country will treat them at least decently well. The United States does this too, by the way, and you can look at the history. For instance, during World War II, there were many German prisoners of war in the United States. The living conditions weren't great, but they were good enough that actually many of those soldiers ended up defecting to the United States afterward anyway, and setting up lives here. The reason that they want to treat, we want to treat our POWs decently is the hope that they will treat theirs, who might be our soldiers, right? But once you're out of uniform and you're not identifying yourself in any way as someone working for this other country, suddenly all bets are off. And so I feel like that's worth mentioning. I'll mention it again at the next presentation because we're going to talk some about ins and outs of the intelligence agencies and that sort of thing. One additional thing I will add, and this is only true of the intelligence agencies, if you think you might apply, say to the CIA, do not follow the CIA on Instagram, Facebook, any social media. Do not establish any visible contact with that agency or any of the other ones. Why might that be?
Is it because it links you to the CIA at a certain point in time, and then they can, other foreign entities can also receive that and have done that?
Exactly. If you go to work for the CIA wants to maintain the impression that you have no connection to them at all, even if you're showing up there at their offices every day, right? And so they recommend that you cut all social media ties. And by the way, it might seem a little weird, but yes, these organizations do have social media presences because they do have their own sort of public relations concerns, and they do put out news and information about the organizations online. And for anyone who's not interested in working there, that's fine. But if you might be, I would leave those alone. I already mentioned about Cuba, in most cases, this isn't true of every country, but in most cases, if you're either studying in a country for more than 90 days or working in a country for more than 90 days, especially if it's a country that is friendly to the United States, you're going to need some sort of a work visa or a study visa at some point. Did you have to get one of those in Spain? No? Were you there for 90 days or? No, okay. I was there for like 5 months, and so we had to go and get visas in the country, in Valencia, at a consulate there. It's not too difficult to do, but the thing is that most people traveling abroad for reasons other than tourism, if they're going to be in that country for an extended period of time, are going to need some kind of a visa. Something I didn't know until recently is that foreign diplomats visiting the United States typically also have to get a special visa before coming here, even if they're very high ranked. There's something called diplomatic immunity. It doesn't always come into play, but typically diplomats in a foreign country will not necessarily be subjected to the laws of that country. It kind of makes sense when you understand that person's here as a representative of the country that they're coming from. And often it doesn't cause much of a legal problem. I mean, diplomats are supposed to be diplomatic, right? You know, it would be bad if they're in a country committing crimes and looking bad for the United States or whatever. But there are all kinds of different visas that you might have to apply for, and that includes work with the Foreign Service and the Peace Corps. In the Foreign Service, if you're on an embassy's soil, legally speaking, you're in that country. So if you went to London and you visited the American embassy, if you step onto the ground at that embassy, legally you're in the United States, okay? And that's true of any country where there is an embassy. But off of there, for most of us who are not diplomats, we will be subject to the laws of that country, and sometimes they can be strange to us anyway. I mean, they're certainly, you know, kind of cultural in their own ways. When I worked for the University of Amsterdam, something I did not expect when I got there and was getting everything ready to go was certain restrictions on how they could pay me and how they could treat me. One thing that they required of me was to buy sort of like an emergency type health insurance in the Netherlands. Compared to American health insurance, it was pretty cheap. I think I paid something like $30 a month, you know? And basically it was just to cover, I don't know, if I had some kind of like a major injury while I was there, you know, that could cover some hospital stays. I mean, thankfully this didn't happen, but, you know, a trip in an ambulance if I needed it. A lot of American health insurance in many countries will cover things like emergencies or basic kind of medical stuff if you catch the flu or something and need to get some medication. But larger costs may not be covered, and so they may require that of you. I also had to get a Dutch social security number. It's called a BSN there. That required me to go to a Dutch office and fill out a whole bunch of information. They gave me one of those so that I could be paid. Basically, you need a social security number in the United States because it helps the IRS know this is officially who this person is, this is how much money they've been paid, and therefore this is how much taxes they owe. When I was in the Netherlands, I was paying taxes in the Netherlands, and then when I brought that money back to the United States, I had to pay taxes on it again. Thankfully, they paid well. So it ended up being a very, very much a net profit. It was, when I was teaching these classes that each of them were about 8 weeks long, and they paid about 10,000 euros, which is about $11,000 or $12,000. That's pretty good, you know. But just something to keep in mind. I also had to get a bank account there. You may have to do that. They were saying, look, we can't pay you in US dollars. We can pay you in euros. And so they needed a local bank account. I got that. If you need to transfer that money back, which is what I've done in the past, coming back into the States, you'll need to pay a small fee. I recommend Wise, which used to go by the name TransferWise. It can take a couple of days, but your money will deposit into your bank internationally. You should consider the exchange rate too, but not only the exchange rate. There are other considerations like in some countries rent may be very high while food is relatively cheap. But one of the most important considerations to make is to keep an eye on the country's inflation as the time approaches. If a country is experiencing extreme inflation, which is relatively unusual, but it can happen, that could throw off your estimates of cost of living. And unless you're working for the State Department, which would be able to compensate for that sort of thing, or the Peace Corps, in which, I hate to break it to you, they're not paying you anyway. they're paying for you to be there. You know, you're not having to pay anything either, but you're not receiving a paycheck for it. Other than that, just something to bear in mind. Some vaccinations, of course, are required for travel to certain regions. The only one I would mention, and this isn't even a vaccination, but in some countries there's malarial medication that is required. Most people do fine with malarial medication, but some people don't do so well. A friend of mine, his name is Dave McLean, got a Fulbright scholarship, went to India, was having a wonderful experience there until he went out with some friends to a restaurant one night, blacked out suddenly, and woke up in a train station with several police officers over him, and who told him basically that he had been completely out of his mind for about 3 days. They were very kind to him. Everybody, they took him to a hospital and were checking on him, and it turned out that he was one of those people who had a very bad reaction to an anti-malarial drug that caused a kind of like psychosis almost to set in. He wrote a book about it, if you want to read it. It's called The Answer to the Riddle Is Me. When he first woke up, he didn't even know who he was. I only say that because some of the medications, it might be a good idea to start them sometime before you leave, just to see how you do. There have been advances in that sort of medication since that time. Okay, I included an image of peanut butter here. The reason is that one of the weirdest pieces of advice that I got the first time I ever went abroad, other than to Canada, was to Spain. A friend of mine who worked for the State Department in Italy said, "Just trust me, pack a jar of peanut butter." He said, "Do you like peanut butter?" And I was like, "Yeah, that's all right." And so, "Are you allergic to peanuts?" No, that's fine. He said, "Okay, just put it in your suitcase, trust me." After I'd been in Spain for like a month, I wanted peanut butter, and it was nowhere to be found. And I don't know exactly what that was. Like, I don't eat peanut butter that often here, but I think maybe it was just like something kind of familiar, and it was nice to be able to spread it on a piece of bread and just eat it. Something strange that I have noticed in the Netherlands too. So the Dutch people, just so you know, on average are the tallest in the world. And I'm not. So mirrors tended to be up really high everywhere that I went. But what was weird to me is, like, despite that, their sinks for hand washing were always really small. They're like that big, and I'm trying to get both hands in there. It's just strange. And like, did you notice anything in Spain that you wouldn't expect, but?
Not that I can remember.
Yeah. Something I noticed in Spain is that sometimes I would think people were having a big argument when they weren't. Like, they were just having a conversation, but they were like shouting and gesticulating really. And I don't know, I think it's just kind of a cultural thing, but it's just a little different. Has anybody else had experiences abroad that were interesting? Experiences that you didn't expect, maybe? Yeah.
So my family's from India, so we travel there about once every 5 years or so. And like a big thing is that like milk isn't like pasteurized there, so you always have to boil it before you drink it. And it's just weird because like you want a glass of cold milk, you can't have it unless you sit in the fridge overnight.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, I guess, something you got to get used to maybe if you want a glass of milk, yeah. And in that case, it's important for safety. Yeah. And speaking of safety too, and aside from kind of just small differences that are part of the fun, I think, of traveling abroad, if you're working especially for the Foreign Service, but also for some private companies, you may end up in a location where it's not super easy to leave, say, the US Embassy in a safe way. An example of that right now, I mean, one of the largest, in fact, it may be the largest US Embassy in the world is in Baghdad, Iraq. And although Iraq is much more stable now than it was, say, several years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it's still considered somewhat dangerous to travel outside of the American compound there. As an example too, I use Port Moresby, New Guinea. It no longer has this distinction, but as of 5 or 10 years ago, it was one of the most dangerous cities in the world, mostly just for crime. And yet there is an embassy there too. And so I think that's something important to keep in mind, especially if you've visited countries before where those sorts of problems aren't so omnipresent, that it is possible to end up in situations where you might be more restricted to these kinds of spaces. Outside of stuff like US embassies and consulates, I mentioned up here, major oil companies have built these large compounds throughout the world, especially in places where they're looking to extract oil. So places like Venezuela, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia. And I did my graduate, my PhD degree at the University of Houston, which is a city founded on oil. And while I was doing that, those 5 years that I was there, I was teaching classes at the University of Houston, and oftentimes I would have students, I would ask them, where are you from? Where'd you grow up? I'm just curious, it'd be like the first day of class, get to know you a little bit. And students would say things like Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, stuff like that. And I would be like, wow, really? You fit in so well here, and I don't hear any accent in your voice. I mean, I wasn't really saying that, but I was thinking, wow, how does this work? And they're like, oh, well, I was at an American school on an American compound at the Shell facility there, and they're like, we had a Walmart and a McDonald's and all this stuff. And I was like, whoa. And they said, it's basically, it's like a corporate version of a military base, and just like all Americans and British people. So that's another way that you can work abroad if you're interested. I do recommend keeping the nearest embassy or consulate in your phone. But with that said, make sure that your mobile phone will work wherever you're going. In most cases, these days, it shouldn't be a problem with the phone you have, although you may need to contact your service provider and let them know, I'm going to be in this other part of the world. Can I get a couple months or a year or however much to have my same number work there? I have never had a problem with that with Verizon, although I have to pay a little bit more every month while I'm gone. But it is something to keep in mind. In many cases, even in countries these days in the developing world, while many of those countries are still very much developing, many of them do nonetheless have really solid mobile internet infrastructure at this point. Part of the reason is that they have received many of those attributes more recently than we have here in the United States. So, for instance, we're still resting on infrastructure that's been there for several decades. Whereas if you're in certain parts of the world that didn't have it until recently, they may well have the very latest technology in place. And so it should be workable. I was actually in DC with SPIA last week, and I was talking to somebody who had recently been working in rural Indonesia and talking about how he was with the World Food Program there, and while he was there, he was able on his iPhone to watch Georgia football games, despite being like out of the country, and it was amazing, but it was really important to me. So, have a plan for emergencies. One of my closest friends right now is, he teaches for Bard College, which is an American college located in upstate New York, but he teaches for Bard College in Palestine. And so he's in the West Bank right now. I've been in touch with him via Facebook Messenger. I haven't heard from him in almost 3 days, and I hope that's because he's leaving. But one thing that he has said to me when we've been in contact over the past couple of weeks is that it's been difficult to get flights out because so many flights are leaving. And so I think he's been working on that. I'm not too concerned about him. He has worked in other places that have experienced conflict, including Bosnia and other parts of the world. And I think he knows what he's doing and he can get out of there if he needs to. But it's important, even if you're not in a country that's experiencing unrest, to have a means to get out. And part of the reason is not just because of the political unrest, but say that somebody calls at home and you've got somebody who's very sick and you really need to go visit this person. There could be an emergency in the United States that you need to come back to. And of course, there are emergency situations involving things like natural disasters that can really happen in lots of places, but some parts of the world might be more prone to that. There have very recently been a couple of hurricanes that have hit Mexico really hard. And in at least one case, a hurricane kind of came up out of nowhere. There was very little time to prepare for it. And of course, Mexico, like the southeastern United States, is not, hurricanes are fairly normal there, but it's just to say that these kinds of natural disasters can happen in many places, and it's just something to be ready for. And this is where I was going to conclude and just open it up to questions, but a few opportunities that you may not have thought about. A big one is JET. I can actually show you the website. The Japan Exchange and Teaching Program. This is a huge program where people, mostly it's Americans who go to Japan to teach English to usually Japanese children, either very young or up through high school age and so forth. They hire lots of Americans to do this. Usually you go for a couple of years. I have a couple of former colleagues who did the JET program. By the time they came back, they were fluent in Japanese and had lived there for a few years and said they loved it. I personally would love to go to Japan. I've never been there. I'm not looking into this program, but if you're looking for something, say an alternative to the Peace Corps, the JET program is very, very popular. If you speak another language very, very well, translation work could be in the cards. And even if you don't yet, it might work out that you could do a program like JET or the Peace Corps, and by the time you come back, you'll be fluent enough in another language that can work out well for you. I have another good friend who's a French translator. She's American. She grew up close. We went to high school together in Florida. And didn't speak much French at the time, but she spent enough time in France and in Francophone countries in Africa to get really fluent in it, and now she's able to make a living that way. I also mentioned, of course, not just the Foreign Service, but the Foreign Service scholarships. Does anyone know Elizabeth Hughes here on campus? She's a good person to know if you're interested in these scholarships. They're basically these awards that you get through the Foreign Service that provide tuition usually it's for a master's degree, with the agreement that when you're done with the master's degree, you will go to work for the Foreign Service for 5 years. And 5 years is the standard Foreign Service assignment, so that part's not unusual. What it does mean, though, is if you receive a Boren Award or a Wrangel Award to do these kinds of things, or a Pickering Award, that you don't have to go through the traditional path to get into the Foreign Service. You don't have to take the Foreign Service exam. You don't have to go through all of the interviews. The scholarships are very, very competitive, but it is another way to get into that kind of work. And Elizabeth Hughes, who works in the Honors College, is an expert on preparation for applying to exactly these things, as well as Fulbright programs in which you can study basically just about anything outside the United States. And of course, I mentioned multinational corporations might need Americans to work outside the United States. It's not that uncommon, but it's important to bear in mind that it's usually easier for companies to hire people in the countries where they want them to work, just because of legal restrictions. You know, if they can hire somebody in Ireland for Coca-Cola and it's a person with Irish citizenship, then suddenly the Coca-Cola Corporation doesn't have to worry about visas and, you know, transferring money in and out and stuff like that. They can just set up an operation there and hit the ground running. When I was in Spain, I actually tried to get a part-time job teaching English as a foreign language to people in Spain, and it was really hard to do. I found, and part of it, and I did not expect this, was that there was, and this is not to disparage the Spanish people, there was a preference for English speakers of British English, not American English so much. I mean, they're okay with American English, but there was a sense, and honestly, like, I think sometimes there's a kind of sense of that here in the United States. It's like, you know, we tend, and this has been proven in studies, we tend to trust people more who speak with a British accent, you know, and so there was that kind of preference that I encountered in Spain, although I was never treated badly. I just found it harder to get a job there. Clearly, the JET program does not experience any of that, but it might be worth asking around about. Are there certain things I should be aware of in a different country that I might not be otherwise? As I said, this is a very big kind of overview thing. I think a lot of the legal issues are very important to be aware of and stuff that it's important to keep in mind. But does anybody have any questions, or you want to add anything to any of this? Yeah.
I wanted to add, I'm currently applying for the Critical Language Scholarship. It's another one of the Foreign Services scholarships. It's sponsored by the Department of State, and they provide like full ride everything to learn one of 13 critical languages in that like target country.
Wait, are you applying for a specific language?
Korean.
Korean, nice. That would be great. Yeah. Do you know what the critical languages are?
There's a lot.
Yeah.
I know they do Arabic. They used to do Russian.
They still do, actually. Yeah, but you wouldn't go to Russia. Yeah. Yeah. So the State Department has identified, and these sometimes change over time, but what they call critical languages, which are languages other than English in parts of the world that are considered very important to U.S. national interests. And so oftentimes it's languages in parts of the world where there might be some sort of unrest or special kind of interest in U.S. diplomacy and that sort of thing. And so Russian, Arabic is still one of them right now, Urdu, Korean, Japanese is one of them, Mandarin Chinese. Perhaps the most kind of niche language right now, and that is spoken by the fewest number of these people, is Azerbaijani. Does anybody know why that might be a particular interest right now in world affairs?
I mean, like, I know they were just having a big conflict with Armenia, and Russia has a big influence on them.
That's right. Yeah, there's a large Armenian population in Azerbaijan, and the Armenian people have long been oppressed in many parts of kind of that part of East Asia and Eastern Europe, or I'm sorry, West Asia and Eastern Europe, and there has been a recent conflict, which is really just a reiteration of a conflict that's been going on for a long time there, and some concerns. I don't know that it's happened yet, but concerns about some genocidal operations there. So the United States is interested in that.
The Bourne Award also goes off of that critical language list.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And these are languages that they need people to know, and because of these kinds of scholarships with the critical languages, what you're basically saying is, yeah, I'm willing to go and study these languages really intensely and get up to speed on them very quickly in order to hopefully apply for a job with the Foreign Service or another American agency to work in the interest of the United States abroad.
Also with Bourne, you can like argue for a language and set up
Yeah.
your own program kind of.
That's very true. Two languages that are not included, although they are still of great value to the State Department, are Spanish and French. The main reason that they're not included as critical languages is just that so many Americans speak Spanish and or French. And so there's already like a large pool of applicants there. However, as I said, I mean, beyond France, for instance, you have Francophone Africa, parts, even Francophone South America, Haiti, many other parts of the world where French can be really necessary for that sort of work, and Spanish the same way. One of the most widely spoken languages in the world. And so it's not that if you're studying one of these languages, you should feel like, oh, it's all for naught. That's not the case. But they are not considered the critical languages at the moment. And yes, you can make an argument for other ones too. Recently, when we had Saul Hernandez, the diplomatic residence, came and visited, he talked about being stationed in, he was in Colombia for a little while, someplace else in South America, I think maybe Argentina, and then he went to Georgia. Not Georgia, but the Republic of Georgia. And he was like, nobody who was applying for that post spoke Georgian. And so he said, it was just kind of like part of the deal, that they're just going to train you, in the Georgian language before you go there. And in some cases where, yeah, it's a smaller country, there may not be as many people who speak it already. In many cases, the State Department will prepare you. The Peace Corps can help you too. Our representative spent his time in Cambodia and is now fluent in Cambodian. And he said it was an amazing experience. He lived in this small town, and he said that the people in this very small, almost like a village, that they were constantly looking out for him. He lived at a family's house there, and that if he happened to not be home and it was after dark, they'd start calling his phone. They're like, "Are you all right?" And he said it was enduring, but they were so happy that he was there, and he's such a nice guy anyway. And he was basically helping them establish some small businesses to kind of help their town grow a little bit, and they wanted him to be there. Anybody else, anything that you would add, or if you have additional questions? No? Okay. Does anybody, you may already have it, does anybody want one of my cards that has my email address on it? And my phone number. Email is the best way to get in touch with me. But I bring these around. Like I said, we can set up individual appointments if you like. Over here. Yeah. You're welcome.
I already got one.
Cool. You're welcome. And yeah, just let me know if I can help with anything. And not even only with work outside the U.S. I mean, I'm here to help with all the work you're interested in. Like I said, I was in D.C. last week. I talked to a whole bunch of people who want to connect with UGA for internships. And so if you're interested in working in Washington, there's some really great opportunities there too. Has anybody done that? Or studied in Washington? You live at the Delta Hall?
No, I was too young. I did it after my freshman year, and they only let you do it if you're a second year by time.
Gotcha. Did you?
I did it this summer, yeah.
Did you stay at Delta Hall? It's really nice, isn't it? And so centrally located. But you don't have to either. So,
You can pay for a really bad apartment. Great.
yeah. Delta Hall's a nice resource, but you do what you gotta do. All right, well, y'all have a good afternoon, and just let me know if I can be of any assistance. Thanks for coming. There are definitely internships all over the city, and the Foreign Service does offer internships. The ones that they're looking for next summer, the applications.
Oh, well, those, yeah.
But you looked at it for later, just start looking early next fall, and you should definitely look into that. There are also a lot of internships on Capitol Hill, like working as an intern for a particular representative or a senator or something like that. And then other internships with various NGOs and stuff. But the greatest thing to me, as someone who has worked for the federal government and lived in DC, is that UGA, as long as you're not a first-year student, gives you a place to live, you know, in a city that can be very expensive. And it's in a really safe, nice neighborhood. Most interns there can just walk to work every day, and then you've got classes that you take. It's cool, right? It's really nice.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Hey. I saw your email about Atlas and stuff, and you just the reply to the copied email that you got from them.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm gonna send them something probably tomorrow.
Okay.
What do you recommend I put into that?
Here's what I do, actually. I met with them
Uh-huh.
last Friday,
Okay.
and what I asked for from them, they were super excited. They've got internships now and postgraduate fellowships. They're working to get me a new job posting
Okay.
with all the information about how to apply and what the jobs will involve and everything. There are two people there. One is named Alexis, she's the one I met with, and then another person named Chessie. And once I have that, I'll have even better information to
Okay.
give to you.
Okay.
And we can get that set up, and I can get your resume to them. And if you want me to look over resume, cover letter, whatever,
Okay.
before you even send it, I can do that too.
Okay, perfect.
Alright.
Yeah, just let me know when that's all out, and I'll
Sure.
figure something out.
Yeah, because they had really only kind of sent me a link to the website, and there was not a ton of information about what they wanted, and that's basically what I told them, and they were like, oh yeah, we'll give you everything you